The Vanished Gold Bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. Unraveling the whereabouts of all 500 tons adrift in Siberia. In 2018, a fraud case related to a sunken ship occurred in South Korea. This incident is known as the Donskoy fraud case. Summarizing the coverage by South Korean media at the time, the details of the case are as follows. The South Korean company Chenil Group discovered a sunken ship near Ulyong Island. The sunken ship turned out to be the Imperial Russian warship, the Dmitry Donskoy. The Chenil Group claimed that the Dmitry Donskoy carried gold bullion worth $140 billion and asserted ownership as the first discoverer. They then planned to issue a cryptocurrency backed by these gold bullion and raised a significant amount of investment. However, in reality, the Dmitry Donskoy had already been discovered by a South Korean marine research institution in 2003, and the submarine pilot involved in this investigation testified that they had not seen any gold bullion. The Chenil Group hastily denied the discovery of the gold bullion, but the South Korean police suspected them of investment fraud and arrested several individuals associated with the Chenil Group. This incident is not particularly surprising. Fraud cases involving sunken ships and hidden treasures like this are happening all around the world. In fact, there was another fraud case involving the Dmitry Donskoy in South Korea back in 2000. Why do frauds of this kind persist and repeat themselves over time? Is it because the legend of hidden treasure captivates people so strongly? This time, I will shine a spotlight on the Romanov Dynasty's gold bullion, lost during the turmoil of the late Imperial Russia, and thoroughly investigate their whereabouts. History of Romanov Dynasty and Russian Empire. First, let's learn a bit about the history of the Romanov Dynasty and the Russian Empire. In 1613, the Romanov Dynasty was born in Russia, and its first ruler was Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. Under the rule of the Romanov Dynasty, Russia experienced rapid expansion and growth. By 1721, it proclaimed itself an empire, and by the late 19th century, its territory spanned over 20 million square kilometers, and its population had surpassed 100 million people. The Russian Empire, which had grown enough to rival the British Empire for global dominance, clashed with the modernized Empire of Japan, which had undergone the Meiji Restoration in the Far East region. It's the Russo-Japanese War. The Dmitry Donskoy, which was mentioned earlier, participated in the Battle of Tsushima during the Russo-Japanese War and ultimately sank near South Korea's Ulyong Island. By the way, in the recurring Donskoy fraud case, the most crucial factor is the large quantity of gold bullion said to have been left inside the sunken ship. However, the outflow of gold bullion from the Russian Empire occurred during the Revolutionary and Civil War periods after 1917. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Donskoy, which sunk in 1905, was loaded with gold bullion. After the Russo-Japanese War, the relations between Japan and Russia were amicable. Both countries participated in World War I as part of the Allied powers. During World War I, the Russian Empire struggled considerably against the Central Powers, such as the German Empire. The Russians grew weary of the prolonged war, leading to a significant decline in their loyalty towards their emperor. In 1917, during the midst of the war, the Russian Revolution finally erupted. As a result, Emperor Nicholas II abdicated the throne, and the Romanov Dynasty, which had endured for approximately 300 years, came to an end. The Romanov dynasty was overthrown and replaced by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were the predecessors of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks seized power in the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the Soviet Union was established in 1922. This period from 1917 to 1922 is known as the Russian Civil War. During this civil war, the revolutionary Bolshevik forces known as the Red Army clashed with the counter-revolutionary forces mainly supporting the Romanov dynasty, known as the White Army. In this video, the Bolshevik government during this 5-year period of the Russian Civil War is referred to as Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia, victorious in the Russian Civil War, established the Soviet Union in 1922. the Soviet Union grew into a superpower after World War II. However, it collapsed in 1991 after losing the Cold War with the United States. The successor to the Soviet Union is the present-day Russian Federation. I explained it quite briefly, but this is the history of Russia from the establishment of the Romanov Dynasty to the present. The vanished gold bullion of the Romanov Dynasty refers to the gold bullion owned by the Romanov Dynasty that became lost due to the turmoil of the 1917 Russian Revolution and the subsequent 5 years of the Russian Civil War. The quantity is an astonishing 500 tons. 500 tons of gold bullion. First, I will explain units of weight. The vanished gold bullion of the Romanov Dynasty is an incredible amount. Therefore, I will use the unit of weight ton in this video, and the ton I will use is the metric ton. Please note that I'm not referring to the long ton or short ton. In the metric system, 1 ton is equal to 1,000 kilograms. Next, I will explain about the price of gold. In this video, I have set the average price of gold for the past few years at $50 per gram. Therefore, it is $50,000 per kilogram and $50 million per ton. The vanished gold bullion of the Romanov Dynasty amounts to exactly 500 tons. Therefore, it is equivalent to $25 billion. This is an astronomical figure. By the way, the 500 tons of gold bullion is equivalent to the current gold reserves of the European Central Bank. Lastly, I will explain how much volume a 1-ton gold bullion occupies. It's about this much. Transporting gold is quite challenging. 2 key individuals. I will introduce 2 key individuals who are indispensable for explaining the vanished gold bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. One of them is Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak. Kolchak was a nobleman and an admiral in the Russian Imperial Navy. He was the most prominent leader of the White Army during the Russian Civil War, and his loyalty to the Romanov dynasty was extremely strong. The other person is Grigory Mikhailovich Semyonov. Semyonov was a leader of the Cossacks. He looks very dignified in this photograph, but at the time of the capture he was only 27 years old. From Semyonov's upbringing to outbreak of World War I, Semyonov was born on September 13, 1890, in the Trans-Baikal region of eastern Siberia. His father was a Cossack of Buryat-Mongol descent, and his mother was likely Russian. Semyonov identified himself as a Buryat-Mongol rather than a Russian. He was fluent in both Russian and Mongolian languages. He strongly desired the establishment of the Greater Mongolia. Cossacks refers to a distinct military organization or its members composed of people who fled from the serfdom of Imperial Russia or impoverished rural nobles. In simple terms, they were individuals who disliked the control of the Russian central government and sought to live freely on the vast land. The leader of the Cossacks is referred to as Ataman, so he was also called Ataman Semyonov. Semyonov had a fierce temperament and often displayed rough behavior, which caused even the Allied powers, who should have been his allies, to dislike him. However, he had a good relationship only with Japan. By the way, Semyonov and Kolchak had a very poor relationship. This was due to differences in their political ideologies, and they are going to be explained later. When Semyonov was 13 years old, the Russian Empire engaged the Empire of Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. Afterwards, Semyonov enrolled in the military school in Chita, but by that time, the relations between Japan and Russia had improved. Chita later became his military base. And on July 28, 1914, when Semyonov was 23 years old, World War I broke out. The Russian Revolution in Lenin. The flames of war that ignited in the Balkan Peninsula, often referred to as the powder keg of Europe, quickly spread across the globe. The outbreak of World War I divided the world into the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The core of the Central Powers consisted of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, the core of the Allied Powers included the United Kingdom, France, and the Russian Empire, with additional support from the United States and Japan. At the start of the war, the Russian Empire possessed a staggering 1,240 tons of gold bullion. This is equivalent to 62 billion US dollars. In the early stages of the war, the Russian Empire faced significant challenges. The military might of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was formidable. And on top of that, the Russian Empire had long borders with these countries. Semyonov also participated in the war and achieved some successes. However, the Russians grew weary of the prolonged war, leading to a significant decline in their loyalty towards their emperor. In March 1917, a revolution finally erupted within Russia, leading to the abdication of Nicholas II. The revolution that occurred during World War I was the Russian Revolution. However, it's important to note that the term Russian Revolution refers to the collective term for the two revolutions that occurred in 1917. One was the February Revolution, which began on March 8th, and the other was the October Revolution, which started on November 7th. The reason for the 1-month difference between the month of the revolution and its name is that Russia at that time was using its own calendar. If we followed the present general Gregorian calendar, the February Revolution would be the March Revolution, and the October Revolution would be the November Revolution. However, in this video, I will use the historical names. There were significant differences between the February Revolution and the October Revolution. The February Revolution was relatively moderate. The regime caused Nicholas II to abdicate his throne, but did not intend to execute the imperial family. They aimed for a political system similar to that of Britain or France, and their leader was Kerensky. On the other hand, the October Revolution was considerably violent. This revolution was instigated by the Bolsheviks led by Lenin. They were planning the assassination of the entire imperial family. Furthermore, the political system they aimed for was unprecedented communism. Lenin, a political exile, was in Switzerland when the February Revolution occurred, but upon hearing news of the revolution, he promptly returned to Russia. The reason Lenin was able to return to Russia was because the moderate government that emerged from the February Revolution implemented an amnesty for political convicts. What Lenin consistently advocated to his Bolshevik comrades was a violent revolution. He said, "Overthrow the government of the February Revolution to establish a communist regime. Discussion is meaningless. Violence is the only solution. Comrades, pick up your guns now." While there were Bolshevik members who opposed Lenin's radical and violent assertions, his views ultimately became dominant. Lenin possessed not only dangerous ideologies, but also charisma. There was a man who regarded Lenin as a threat. Lavur Kornilov. He was the most powerful military figure in Russia at the time. Kornilov was wary of the growing influence of the Bolsheviks and the spread of Lenin's dangerous ideologies day by day. In August 1917, Kornilov finally initiated an uprising. His goal was the eradication of the Bolsheviks. Semyonov also participated in Kornilov's uprising. Kornilov marched his forces towards the capital city of Petrograd, present-day St. Petersburg. The head of the February Revolution government, Kerensky, supported Kornilov. The Bolshevik faction within the February Revolution government, heavily influenced by Lenin's dangerous ideologies, posed a threat to Kerensky, which was why he allied with Kornilov. However, upon seeing the approaching Kornilov forces towards the capital, Kerensky suddenly became anxious. He had this thought: after Kornilov defeats the Bolshevik faction, he might arrest me, who is the head of the February Revolution government. What did Kerensky do? He actually allied with the Bolsheviks. This choice turned out to be the worst one. The Bolsheviks formed an army and decisively defeated the Kornilov forces that had entered the capital city. Kornilov was arrested and Semyonov fled. Moreover, the army created by the Bolsheviks at this time became the Red Army. Red is the symbolic color of communism, and the significance of the Red Army lies in communism, the Bolsheviks, and the Soviet Union. Kerensky's misguided decision at this time ultimately gave rise to the Red Army. By the way, Kornilov, who was arrested, quickly escaped and threw himself into the fight against the Red Army. With the establishment of the Red Army, Lenin became very confident. On November 7, 1917, the Second Revolution, known as the October Revolution, finally erupted. The February Revolution government under Kerensky was overthrown, and the Bolshevik regime, namely Soviet Russia, took its place. Lenin achieved his goal. However, this hasty, violent, and unjustified revolution was not accepted by many sensible individuals. The red flag raised in Petrograd was a signal cannon announcing the start of the Russian Civil War. Semyonov's proactive actions were particularly prominent. After the failure of Kornilov's uprising, he fled to his hometown Chita. However, just 2 days before the October Revolution, on November 5th, he had already established the Mongol Buryat Regiment. Going forward, I will refer to this regiment as the Semyonov Corps. The astute Semyonov foresaw that Lenin would initiate another revolution. Furthermore, just 11 days after the October Revolution, on November 18th, Semyonov launched an attack on the Red Army in Ulan-Ude. This is one of the remarkable events in world history, because this was the first ever attack against the Red Army. Simultaneously with the start of the Russian Civil War, the Red Army attacked the national banks in Petrograd and Moscow. The total amount of gold bullion they seized was 976 tons. At the start of World War I, the Romanov Dynasty possessed 1,240 tons of gold bullion. In other words, during the 3 years and several months of the war, it decreased by 264 tons. This was a rapid decline. Needless to say, the cause of this significant decrease was the war, and the recipient of gold was primarily the United Kingdom. Admiral Kolchak the Ronin. On November 24, 1917, Kolchak, who had just celebrated his 44th birthday, arrived at the port of Yokohama in Japan. During the long sea voyage, Kolchak heard rumors about Lenin and the October Revolution. He wanted more detailed information, so he hurried to the Russian embassy in Tokyo. At that time, Russian embassies and consulates around the world were on the side of the White Army. The White Army, in short, can be described as an anti-Lenin group. Specifically, it included supporters of the Romanov Dynasty, like Kolchak, the capitalist class opposing communism, and ethnic minorities who disliked Lenin's dictatorship. What we need to pay attention to here is the political ideologies of the Red Army and White Army. As you know, the political ideology of the Red Army was solely centered around communism, which gave them a strong sense of unity. However, the White Army, while sharing the goal of overthrowing Lenin and the Red Army, had diverse political ideologies. This fact meant that the sense of solidarity within the White Army was inferior to that of the Red Army. The lack of strong unity was indeed the biggest weakness of the White Army. Needless to say, Semyonov and Kolchak belonged to the White Army. In the sense of being opposed to the Red Army, they were comrades. However, Kolchak's aspiration for the restoration of the Romanov Dynasty and Semyonov's desire for the establishment of the Greater Mongolia were in complete contradiction. Where is the territory of the Greater Mongolia? It constitutes half of the Russian Empire. Isn't that very complicated? Now, what was the reason for Kolchak's visit to Japan? Until 6 months ago, Kolchak had been fighting as a naval commander in the waters near Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, like the German Empire, was part of the Central Powers. However, when the February Revolution erupted in their home country of Russia, the sailors under his command underwent changes. They stopped obeying their superior Kolchak. There was a reason for this. The February Revolution represented a kind of antithesis to the aristocracy, including the emperor and Kolchak, and most of the sailors were from the lower class. Their disobedience eventually led to Kolchak being removed from his command. It could have even been a rebellion rather than mere disobedience. Humiliated, Kolchak threw his ceremonial saber into the sea and left the warship. Afterward, Kolchak was ordered by the military to travel to the United States and then return to Russia via Japan. It was during his journey on a ship from America to Yokohama that he heard rumors about the October Revolution. Looking back, from the start of World War I to 1917. Let's take a look back at the events from the start of World War I to 1917. On July 28, 1914, World War I broke out. At that time, the Russian Empire possessed 1,240 tons of gold. In March 1917, 3 years after the start of the war, the February Revolution erupted in Russia. Emperor Nicholas II abdicated, and the Romanov Dynasty came to an end. In April, Lenin returned from his exile in Switzerland to Petrograd and called for a violent revolution. In June, Kolchak left the warship due to the disobedience of the sailors. From August to September, Kornilov's uprising failed. Kornilov was arrested, and Semyonov fled. On November 5th, Semyonov established the Semyonov Corps in his hometown Chita. On November 7th, the October Revolution erupted. The Red Army, led by Lenin, overthrew the February Revolution government. Furthermore, the Red Army attacked the National Bank and seized a total of 976 tons of gold bullion. With the outbreak of the October Revolution, the Russian Civil War began. On November 18th, the Semyonov Corps attacked the Red Army in Ulan-Ude. This was the first ever attack against the Red Army. On November 21st, Kolchak arrived at the port of Yokohama. The next chapter takes us into 1918. The story of the Romanovs' gold is about to take significant strides. Before that, let me explain a bit about the railway situation at that time. This will be beneficial for your understanding. Railways are still crucial infrastructure today, but they were even more important back then. This was because railways were responsible for transporting military forces. In this video, there are 3 significant railways. The first one is the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Trans-Siberian Railway connects Moscow to the far east city of Vladivostok. This railway branches off from Moscow to Omsk, but in this video, both routes are referred to as the Trans-Siberian Railway. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway was funded by French capital, but it is considered as part of the Russian Empire for convenience. The second one is the Chinese Eastern Railway. The Chinese Eastern Railway runs from Chita through Harbin to Vladivostok. Furthermore, a branch line from Harbin extends to Changchun. While most of the railway line is located within China, the owner of the railway was the Russian Empire. The Chinese Eastern Railway also employed local Chinese workers, but the majority of the railway staff were the Russians. The third one is the South Manchuria Railway. It runs from Changchun to the port city of Dalian. As a result of the Russo-Japanese War, this railway line was ceded to Japan. Therefore, the owner was Japan. The Changchun Station, where the South Manchuria Railway and the Chinese Eastern Railway intersect, effectively served as the Russo-Japanese border. The Chinese Eastern Railway and the South Manchuria Railway were unique railway companies. Both were located outside their respective home countries and operated as organizations resembling independent governments, complete with administrative, judicial, diplomatic, and military functions, in addition to their core railway operations. During that time, such organizational structures were not uncommon. The Chinese Eastern Railway could be seen as a miniature Russian empire located outside of Russia, while similarly, the South Manchuria Railway represented a miniature Japan situated outside of Japan. Chinese Eastern Railway. In the spring of 1918, after the new year had arrived, Kolchak was in Harbin. Harbin is a major city located in the present-day northeastern part of China, and this vast region in northeastern China was referred to as Manchuria at that time. The reason for Kolchak's presence in Harbin was that the Chinese Eastern Railway had appointed him as a military commander. Initially, Kolchak had planned to return to Russia, but due to the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, he temporarily postponed that plan and decided to work for the Chinese Eastern Railway instead. The top authority of the Chinese Eastern Railway was the veteran leader Horvat. The reason Horvat appointed Kolchak as the head of the military division was that he highly valued Kolchak's military talents and loyalty to the Romanov Dynasty. Needless to say, the enemy of the Chinese Eastern Railway was the Red Army, led by Lenin. The offer from Horvat was appealing to Kolchak. However, Kolchak realized that the enemy wasn't just the Red Army shortly after he started working. In fact, Horvat had also employed Semyonov. The Semyonov Corps, based in Chita, was a crucial force for the Chinese Eastern Railway. One day an incident occurred. When Kolchak visited Manjuli Station on the Chinese-Russian border for a frontline inspection, Semyonov, who was Kolchak's subordinate, refused to greet him at the station. An outraged Kolchak complained to Horvat about Semyonov's rudeness. However, Horvat did not punish Semyonov. This was because Horvat could not assert authority over Semyonov, who commanded a large army. After this incident, Semyonov's harassment towards Kolchak continued, and ultimately, Kolchak submitted his resignation to Horvat. Semyonov successfully excluded the newcomer. Ultimately, Kolchak worked in the Chinese Eastern Railway for a few months. I said before, the lack of strong unity was indeed the biggest weakness of the White Army, and this incident with the Chinese Eastern Railway was a prime example of that. Kolchak disliked Semyonov's plan to establish the Greater Mongolia within the territories of the Russian Empire. Semyonov also disliked Kolchak for not recognizing the Greater Mongolia. It's a very tough situation, isn't it? If the top leader Horvat had shown stronger leadership, it would have been better. He was indecisive despite the appearance. There was another reason for Kolchak's failure in his challenge with the Chinese Eastern Railway. It was his personality. Certainly, Kolchak was honest and capable, but he had intense emotional ups and downs. This was also mentioned in the reports of the British ambassador to Japan at the time. This was a major flaw of Kolchak. We should recognize that this flaw prevented him from building good relationships with his colleagues at the Chinese Eastern Railway. Escalation of Russian civil war and theft of 500 tons of gold bullion. On March 3, 1918, around the time Kolchak began his role as a commander on the Chinese Eastern Railway, significant developments took place in World War I. The Bolshevik government led by Lenin, which had seized power through the October Revolution, namely Soviet Russia, concluded a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers. This treaty is known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. As a result of this treaty, Soviet Russia withdrew from World War I and became an enemy of the Allied powers. There were three main reasons why the Allied powers viewed Soviet Russia as an enemy. Reason 1, abandonment of pledge of no separate peace. The core Allied powers, including the United Kingdom, France, and the Russian Empire, shared the pledge of no separate peace. This commitment meant fighting together until the end without dropping out. However, Soviet Russia broke this pledge. Reason 2, export of communist revolution. Lenin attempted to incite communist revolutions in countries other than Russia. This greatly disappointed the Allied powers. Reason 3, cooperation with Central Powers. After exiting the war, Soviet Russia's stance was not neutral, but rather inclined towards the Central Powers. The Allied powers regarded this as a betrayal. Due to the aforementioned reasons, in August 1918, which was just 5 months after the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the Allied powers initiated an intervention war against Russia. This is the Siberian intervention. In other words, the Siberian intervention is an extension of World War I. The Allied powers wanted to overthrow Lenin through the White Army they were supporting. If the White Army became the victors of the Russian Civil War, many issues would have been resolved. However, in contrast to the tightly united Red Army, the White Army was fighting in disarray. With this situation, it was difficult for the White Army to defeat the Red Army. The Allied powers believed that a strong leader capable of commanding all the White Army factions within Russia was necessary. On April 13, 1918, just a month after the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, General Kornilov, who had been leading the White Army with great courage and determination, was killed in action. His death came as a shock to all those associated with the White Army. The civil war was intensifying rapidly. Around June, when Semyonov drove Kolchak out of the Chinese Eastern Railway through various harassments, Lenin moved 511 tons of the acquired 976 tons of gold bullion to the Kazan branch of the National Bank. Lenin believed that storing the gold bullion in Kazan would be safer than in Petrograd or Moscow. On July 16th to 17th, the entire family of former Emperor Nicholas II was murdered. The crime took place in Yekaterinburg, located to the east of the Ural Mountains. The perpetrators were members of the Bolshevik secret police. And finally, that moment arrived. On August 5, 1918, at 8 a.m., the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion attacked the Kazan branch of the National Bank, seized 500 tons of gold bullion, and fled. That's correct. This gold bullion was the very gold that Lenin had intentionally relocated from Petrograd and Moscow due to fear that it might be seized by the White Army. Unfortunately, Lenin's decision ended up backfiring. In this video, the 500 tons of gold bullion seized by the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion at that time are defined as the vanished gold bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. Let's organize the flow of gold bullion up to this point. At the start of World War I, the Russian Empire possessed 1,240 tons of gold bullion. As the Russian Civil War began, the Red Army seized 976 tons of gold bullion from the national banks in Petrograd and Moscow. The decrease of 264 tons was primarily paid to Britain, needless to say, as war expenses. Lenin stored 465 tons out of the 976 tons in Moscow, and he moved the remaining 511 tons to the Kazan branch of the National Bank. On August 5, 1918, the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion seized 500 tons of gold bullion from the Kazan branch of the National Bank. At this point, the distribution of gold bullion between the White Army and the Red Army was as follows. White Army, 500 tons seized by the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion. Red Army, 465 tons stored in Moscow, 11 tons spared from the seizure by the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion at the Kazan branch of the National Bank. Total, 476 tons. The distribution of gold bullion between the two sides became almost equal. Now, who exactly were the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion? Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechoslovak Republic gained independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. The pivotal moment of this independence was the defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I, which had been its suzerain. In 1992, the Czechoslovak Republic dissolved its federal structure and separated into the present-day Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. The Czechoslovak Legion was organized not by the Czechoslovak Republic but by the Russian Empire. During World War I, many Czechoslovak people were conscripted as soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army, but they had no loyalty to their suzerain. This was because their own independence was being thwarted. Czechoslovak soldiers surrendered one after another to the Russian Empire, which gathered them to form units. This became the Czechoslovak Legion. From the very beginning of its formation, the Czechoslovak Legion was highly motivated. They believed that by cooperating with the Russian Empire as part of the Allied powers, they could fulfill their hopes for national independence. However, an unexpected event occurred for the Czechoslovak Legion, the Russian Revolution. As a result, the Russian Empire collapsed, and the newly emerged Soviet Russia swiftly withdrew from the war through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. This meant that the Czechoslovak Legion could no longer fight against their enemy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This situation was quite a betrayal. The Czechoslovak Legion, eager to participate in the war for national independence, had no choice but to go to the Western Front. This was because the withdrawal of Soviet Russia from the war had led to the disappearance of the Eastern Front. Initially, the Czechoslovak Legion had planned to move to the Western Front through this route. However, Soviet Russia, influenced by the intentions of the German Empire, did not allow passage through this route. Moreover, Soviet Russia disarmed the Czechoslovak Legion. As I mentioned earlier, after exiting the war, Soviet Russia's stance was not neutral, but rather inclined towards the Central Powers. Therefore, the situation of the Czechoslovak Legion was dire. For the Czechoslovak Legion, the challenge was how to move to the Western Front, and there was only one option available. That was to take a route around the Earth from the backside. In other words, it meant traveling by the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok in the Russian Far East, crossing the Pacific by ship, and then further moving through the United States and the Atlantic to reach the Western Front in Europe. And thus, an unprecedented journey fraught with interference by the Red Army began. At some point, an incident occurred. The location was Chelyabinsk Station, situated south of Yekaterinburg. The date was May 14, 1918. Unfortunately, at this station, the train carrying the Czechoslovak Legion, heading east, crossed paths with the train carrying soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, heading west to return home. The two sides holding animosity with each other started brawl at the station. The brawl was suppressed by the Bolshevik security authorities, but despite arresting around 10 individuals from the Czechoslovak Legion, the Bolshevik authorities didn't arrest anyone from the Austro-Hungarian Empire's side. This was clearly unfair because, in this brawl, it was the soldiers from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who started the brawl. Needless to say, the Czechoslovak Legion was furious. First, they attacked an armory near the station to obtain weapons. Then, they went on to intimidate the Bolshevik security authorities and successfully rescued their arrested comrades. Lenin immediately issued orders for the shooting of the defiant soldiers of the Czechoslovak Legion. And finally, the Czechoslovak Legion reached the limit of their patience. They solidified their determination to overthrow Soviet Russia and began havoc in towns along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Kappel Legion. Vladimir Kappel was a colonel in the Russian Imperial Army. When Lenin seized power, he founded a legion in his hometown of Samara. Similar to Kolchak, Kappel had a strong loyalty to the Romanov Dynasty. At one point, Kappel heard rumors about the Czechoslovak Legion causing havoc along the Trans-Siberian Railway. They seemed to be attacking the Red Army. This was good news for Kappel. Kappel promptly met with the Czechoslovak Legion, who had come near Samara, and proposed a collaboration. Their first joint operation was the capture of Samara. The Czechoslovak Legion had no reason to refuse. In this way, the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion easily captured Samara. This incident greatly alarmed Lenin. Samara was close to Kazan, where the 511 tons of gold had been relocated. Lenin immediately attempted to move the gold from the Kazan branch of the National Bank. However, his decision was too late. Kappel had obtained information that a significant amount of gold had been transported to the Kazan branch of the National Bank. The Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion attacked the bank, seized 500 tons of gold, and returned to Samara. The number 500 might seem rounded, but for Lenin it was a nightmare. Siberian Intervention and Provisional All-Russian Government. In August 1918, around the same time that the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion successfully seized the gold, the Allied powers initiated the Siberian Intervention. British, French, American, and Japanese forces landed in the Far East, including Vladivostok. Geographically nearby, Japan sent a large army over 10,000. The justification for the Siberian intervention was the rescue of the Czechoslovak Legion. In the following September, the White Army governments of Samara and Omsk merged, giving rise to the Provisional All-Russian Government with Samara as its capital. The Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion were incorporated into this government. The 500 tons of gold they seized were placed under the administration of the Provisional All-Russian Government. Furthermore, the Provisional All-Russian Government extended its influence to Semyonov, who was based in Chita. They recognized the Semyonov Corps as the official military forces of the Provisional All-Russian Government and granted him the rank of colonel. Semyonov accepted this. Furthermore, he invited the Japanese military into Chita. In October, the Red Army advanced towards Samara. Recognizing the unfavorable military situation, the Provisional All-Russian Government relocated its capital to Omsk. Omsk is a strategically important city located at the junction of the Trans-Siberian Railway branches leading to Kazan and Samara. However, what's even more significant was that British forces were stationed in Omsk. When the Provisional All-Russian Government relocated its capital to Omsk, it came under strong British influence. In essence, it became a puppet government of Britain. From that point on, I will refer to this as the Omsk government. And once again, that man appeared here, Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. 4 months ago, after being expelled from the Chinese Eastern Railway by Semyonov, he had a meeting with General Alfred Knox of the British Army in Tokyo. General Knox had some reservations about Kolchak's character, but he held his sincere nature in high regard. Consequently, General Knox decided to support Kolchak. General Knox, who was also the commander of the British forces deployed in Omsk, requested that Kolchak be appointed as the Minister of the Army and Navy in the Omsk government. In this way, Kolchak once again had the opportunity to confront the Red Army with the mighty British Empire as his backers. And since the days of the Chinese Eastern Railway, though in a formal capacity, he again became Semyonov's associate. General Knox returned to Omsk ahead of time. After a brief interval, Kolchak entered Omsk, following in his footsteps. In November, the Omsk government transferred the stored 500 tons of gold to the Omsk branch of the National Bank from Samara. On November 11th of the same month, World War I came to an end. As you are aware, the outcome was that the Central Powers were defeated and the Allied powers emerged victorious. The key point here is the Czechoslovak Legion. Their aspiration was the independence of their homeland, and it was almost achieved due to the defeat and dissolution of their former suzerain, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In other words, the Czechoslovak Legion had no reason to remain within Russia anymore. However, the Omsk government didn't want them to return home. The Omsk government viewed the Czechoslovak Legion as valuable military strength. They desperately tried to keep the Czechoslovak Legion from leaving. Even the Czechoslovak Legion couldn't disregard the earnest pleas of the Omsk government. The Omsk government was the successor to the Russian imperial government, and the Czechoslovak Legion owed them a great deal of gratitude for their support, including the establishment of the Legion. In the end, the Czechoslovak Legion chose to remain within Russia and agreed to cooperate with the Omsk government. On the 17th of the same month, a coup erupted in Omsk. The coup was led by General Knox and Kolchak. As a result, Kolchak, who had been the Minister of the Army and Navy, seized power and assumed the role of the supreme ruler. In other words, he became the dictator of the Omsk government. The word coup might carry a negative connotation, but this coup was an exception. Most of the government officials actually supported Kolchak's dictatorship. Everyone was in need of a strong leader. However, there were individuals who did not support this coup. Among them was Semyonov. He objected to Kolchak's appointment as the supreme ruler. He didn't want to accept the career advancement of his rival Kolchak. In response to Semyonov's objection, Kolchak stripped him of the rank of colonel that had been granted to him. Furthermore, he issued an order to suppress the rebels and dispatch troops to Chita. However, in the end, it was the Japanese military stationed in Chita that mediated between the two. Kolchak and Semyonov never came to blows. Kolchak criticized this as interference in Russia's internal affairs by Japan. However, Lenin is the one who benefits from the discord between Kolchak and Semyonov, so it can be considered that the Japanese military did well. Besides, since Kolchak became the dictator of the Omsk government with British support, he shouldn't have reason to condemn Semyonov for partnering with the Japanese military. The end of 1918. During this time, in addition to the Omsk government, there were various White Army governments and military forces within Russia. Each country belonging to the Allied powers was contemplating which of the many White Army organizations to support. Let's take a look at the power dynamics within Russia. West of the Ural Mountains, where the population was concentrated, was under the control of the Red Army. Lenin's strength lay in the sheer number of people he ruled over. The territory of the Omsk government, the White Army's frontrunner, was the western half of Siberia. It's roughly the central part of Russia. The White Army, led by General Wrangel and General Denikin, was deployed in the southern regions of Russia. The Northwestern Army, led by General Yudenich, was operating near Lenin's stronghold Petrograd. Semyonov gained control of eastern Siberia. His base Chita was situated at the junction of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the Chinese Eastern Railway, and it was close to Manchuria, which was under Japanese influence at the time. At this point, it was Britain and Japan that had clear policies. Britain supported the Omsk government led by Kolchak. The Omsk government declared itself the legitimate successor to the Russian imperial government. Japan supported Semyonov in Chita. If Semyonov established the Greater Mongolia in the Far East, Japan would have gained significant benefits. The biggest benefit would have been avoiding the nightmare of sharing a border with Soviet Russia. Notable here is the shrewdness of British diplomacy. Britain didn't disclose the fact that the Omsk government possessed 500 tons of gold bullion to the other Allied powers. In other words, at this point, only Britain was aware of it. Looking back, 1918. Let's take a look back at the events of 1918. On March 3rd, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was signed. Soviet Russia made a separate peace agreement with the Central Powers. The Allied powers regarded Soviet Russia as an enemy. On April 13th, Kornilov was killed in action. On May 14th, a brawl broke out between soldiers of the Czechoslovak Legion and soldiers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at Chelyabinsk Station. As a result, the Czechoslovak Legion resolved to overthrow Lenin and the Red Army. In June, Kolchak withdrew from the Chinese Eastern Railway. In the same month, Lenin transferred 511 tons of gold bullion to the Kazan branch of the National Bank. On July 16th and 17th, the Bolshevik secret police executed the entire family of former Emperor Nicholas II. On August 5th, the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion attacked the Kazan branch of the National Bank and seized 500 tons of gold bullion. In the same month, the Siberian intervention by the Allied powers began. In September, the White Army governments of Samara and Omsk merged, giving rise to the Provisional All-Russian government with Samara as its capital. The 500 tons of gold bullion came under the control of this government. In October, the Provisional All-Russian government extended its influence to Semyonov and relocated the capital from Samara to Omsk. In the same month, Kolchak arrived in Omsk, and based on the recommendation of General Knox of the British Army, he assumed the position of the Minister of the Army and Navy in the Provisional All-Russian government. In November, the Provisional All-Russian government transferred the stored 500 tons of gold bullion from Samara to the Omsk branch of the National Bank. On the 11th of the same month, World War I came to an end. On the 17th of the same month, with the support of General Knox, Kolchak executed a coup and seized all power from the Provisional All-Russian government. This coup led to the establishment of the Omsk government under Kolchak's dictatorship. Semyonov objected to this coup, leading to a crisis in their relationship. However, the Japanese military mediated between the two. At the end of the same year, Britain supported the Omsk government led by Kolchak, while Japan supported Semyonov. Other Allied powers, like the United States, were still contemplating which White Army faction to support. Among the Allied powers, only Britain had information about the 500 tons of gold bullion held by the Omsk government. We've looked at the events of 1918. Kolchak became the Minister of the Army and Navy in the Provisional All-Russian government in October, but in the following November, he conspired with General Knox to seize control of the government. This indicated the closeness between the two. The next chapter takes us into the year 1919. White Army's offensive. In January 1919, at the beginning of the new year, Kolchak established the Commission for Investigating the Execution of the Imperial Family. Around the same time, the Omsk government forces achieved a series of victories over the Red Army, finally crossing the Ural Mountains. In their path, they approached the former capital Samara. Beyond Samara lay Moscow, the stronghold of the Red Army. Seeing Kolchak in great shape, counter-revolutionary forces from various parts of Russia were gradually converging on Omsk. Even Horvat, who had been Kolchak's employer at the Chinese Eastern Railway in Harbin, showed submission to the Omsk government. In return, Horvat was granted the position of Governor-General of the Far East by Kolchak. Horvat, often criticized for his indecisiveness, made swift decisions when it came to his own career advancement. Let's take a look at some of the groups that make up the Omsk government forces. Counter-revolutionary forces gathered from various parts of Russia. The Czechoslovak Legion. The Kappel Legion. The total military force numbered around 300,000. It's not a bad size as a successor to the Russian imperial government. In March, further good news reached the Omsk government forces advancing towards Samara. The White Army generals Wrangel and Denikin achieved victories over the Red Army in the south. Additionally, General Yudenich also began an offensive towards Petrograd. The White Army was gaining momentum. In contrast, Lenin was in distress. Reconciliation between Semyonov and Kolchak. It wasn't just Lenin who was in distress. Semyonov also felt the same way. The White Army, led by supporters of the Romanov Dynasty, such as Kolchak and Denikin, was achieving victory after victory, but Semyonov's influence was diminishing. The Semyonov Corps also had limited financial resources. In such circumstances, the dream of establishing the Greater Mongolia seemed unlikely to materialize. One day, Semyonov received a surprising report from one of his subordinates. The subordinate said, "There is a large amount of gold bullion loaded onto a train heading to Vladivostok." Semyonov hurried to Chita station. Indeed, there were large quantities of gold bullion in the freight cars. The person in charge of the freight cars claimed that the gold bullion was sent by the Omsk government to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Vladivostok. Since the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank is a British-owned bank, the transfer there is equivalent to a transfer to Britain. Semyonov, who was strapped for cash, desperately wanted this gold bullion. However, it was impossible for him to lay hands on the property of the Omsk government. Semyonov decided to take a moment to think calmly. As mentioned earlier, the reason why the Omsk government possessed a substantial amount of gold bullion was due to the seizure by the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion from the Kazan branch of the National Bank. Wise leaders like Kolchak and General Knox chose not to disclose this fact. However, when a major event involving the theft of 500 tons of gold bullion occurs, the impact is immense, and the rumor quickly spread. Semyonov had also heard the rumor, so he quickly got closer to the truth. It seems that the rumor about the seizure of gold bullion in Kazan is true. Currently, the gold bullion is under the control of the Omsk government. The Omsk government requires vast resources to continue the war, and these resources are supplied by its supporter, Britain. Therefore, the transfer of gold bullion from Omsk to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Vladivostok makes sense. Semyonov's reasoning was perfect, and he decided to reconcile with Kolchak in order to have him share the gold bullion. The two of them had not reconciled since the incident of the coup in November of the previous year. In reality, Kolchak also wanted to reconcile with Semyonov. That's because Semyonov's base Chita was strategically important. Semyonov's primary concern was how much of the gold bullion he could acquire. In late May, Semyonov reconciled with Kolchak. Then, in the following June, Semyonov received 34 tons of gold bullion from Kolchak. While opinions may vary on whether this number is large or small, for the time being, Semyonov had successfully overcome his financial crisis. Chita checkpoint operation. While Semyonov had overcome his financial difficulties, his war chest was still far from sufficient. The war against the Red Army and the construction of an independent state required vast funds. Semyonov's primary concern remained Kolchak's gold bullion, but all he could do was monitor the transportation of these gold bullion from Omsk to Vladivostok at Chita station. One summer day, a significant arrival came from Omsk. In General Sergei Rozanov's freight cars, a trusted subordinate of Kolchak, there were 20 tons of gold bullion. The destination for the transportation of these gold bullion was the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank. Since keeping all the gold bullion in Omsk posed a risk, this transportation also served the purpose of dispersing the storage of the gold bullion. For the Omsk government, there were only two destinations for the gold bullion. One of them was the Vladivostok branch of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. This bank was used for payments to Britain. The other one was the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank. This bank was used for settlements with countries other than Britain and for the dispersed storage of the gold bullion. After General Sergei Rozanov passed through Chita station, Semyonov received valuable information. It was about corrupt officials within the Omsk government stealing gold bullion and illegally transferring it overseas. Since the front lines of the war with the Red Army were west of Omsk, the only way to transfer gold bullion abroad was through Vladivostok. It wouldn't have been too difficult for these corrupt officials to divert attention from Kolchak, who was occupied with war leadership. Semyonov came up with a brilliant idea. His plan was to confiscate the gold bullion that the corrupt officials had loaded onto freight cars destined for Vladivostok at Chita station. As mentioned earlier, the designated recipients for the Omsk government's gold were the Vladivostok branch of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank and the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank. Any gold transfers to locations other than these two banks raised strong suspicions of an illegal gold transfer orchestrated by the corrupt officials. Moreover, even if Semyonov confiscated the gold bullion, these officials couldn't report it to anyone because what they were doing was felony. And so, the Chita checkpoint operation began. It was a major project for the Semyonov Corps. Of course, the corrupt officials of the Omsk government panicked. They made futile efforts, such as hiding the gold bullion in blind spots of the freight cars. In the end, Semyonov confiscated 13 tons of gold bullion during the Chita checkpoint operation that spanned about 6 months. Based on my estimation, the total amount of gold bullion that the corrupt officials of Omsk illicitly transferred to Vladivostok was approximately 21 tons. Of this, 13 tons were seized by Semyonov at Chita station. This figure of 13 tons is supported by historical records. In other words, the corrupt officials of the Omsk government were able to illicitly transfer approximately 8 tons overseas through Vladivostok after deducting the 13 tons. It's safe to say it was Semyonov's victory. White Army's downfall. Until the summer of 1919, the White Army had the upper hand. The Omsk government army was closing in on Samara, and figures like Denikin and Wrangel were achieving victories in various regions. What's more, during this time, besides Britain, other Allied powers were also backing the Omsk government, and Kolchak's influence was on the rise on the international stage. The reason why the other Allied powers supported Kolchak goes without saying. It was the 500 tons of gold bullion. By this point, the existence of the gold bullion owned by the Omsk government was a well-known fact worldwide. However, as Russia's brief summer came to an end, the White Army quickly found themselves at a disadvantage, and there were 3 reasons for this. Reason 1, Lenin's total mobilization order. As mentioned earlier, the Red Army controlled the more populated regions. Therefore, Lenin was able to secure a massive military force through conscription, and this forces overwhelmed the White Army. Lenin's total mobilization order led the Red Army to become formidable forces of over 1 million. Reason 2, sabotage. Lenin called for sabotage among the workers in the areas controlled by the White Army. Particularly, the sabotage by the port workers and railway employees in Vladivostok greatly troubled Kolchak. For Omsk, Vladivostok was crucial for the transportation of supplies. Reason 3, failure of economic policies. The Omsk government had its own currency, but it was only a provisional government, and it was in a wartime situation. In such circumstances, people had little faith in the Omsk government's currency. Without the credibility of the currency, there was no way to control inflation. People who had initially hoped for Kolchak were disappointed by the Omsk government, which had ineffective economic policies. In September, General Knox of the British Army finally proposed to Kolchak, "Dear Lord Kolchak, Omsk will soon be surrounded by the enemy. Before that happens, let's transfer the gold bullion and the capital functions to Irkutsk." Kolchak declined this proposal for 3 reasons. Reason 1, there was a risk that the gold bullion could be seized by the Red Army during railway transport. Reason 2, there was a risk that the corrupt officials could steal the gold bullion during railway transport. Reason 3, Kolchak believed that Omsk was the safest place, and as long as he had the gold bullion, he thought he could continue to fight against the Red Army for several years. After his proposal was rejected, General Knox abandoned Kolchak. Britain withdrew the army sent to Russia within the year. Furthermore, by this time, not only the Omsk government, but also other White Army factions were in a disadvantaged position. Once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In late October, Semyonov was facing the largest amount of gold bullion he had ever encountered at Chita Station. The quantity was a staggering 46 tons. Due to the deteriorating war situation, it was evident that the Omsk government was transporting the gold bullion to Vladivostok. Of course, this gold bullion wasn't part of any illegal gold transfer by the corrupt officials, so Semyonov had to expedite its passage. However, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Semyonov. He knew that General Knox had abandoned Kolchak, which meant that the Omsk government was likely to collapse in the near future. A collapsed government is powerless and incapable of any protests or claims. Semyonov boldly confiscated this gold bullion. The excuse he had prepared was temporary storage to protect it from Red Army's seizure. Escape to Irkutsk. On November 13th, Kolchak finally made the decision to abandon Omsk, which was becoming surrounded by the Red Army. Most of the capital functions had already been moved to Irkutsk, but the biggest task remained, the transportation of the gold bullion. Let's summarize the flow of the gold bullion up to the point of Omsk's abandonment. The early Omsk government was very fortunate because they could expropriate the 500 tons of gold bullion that the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion had seized from the Red Army. These 500 tons of gold bullion can be divided into two groups, the portion sent to the east and the stored portion. The portion sent to the east refers to the portion that was shipped from Omsk to the east. Since the front lines with the Red Army were located to the west of Omsk, transporting the gold to the west was not feasible in the first place. The stored portion refers to the portion that the Omsk government stored at the Omsk branch of the National Bank. In other words, it is the part that hadn't been sent to the east by the time Omsk was abandoned. The breakdown of the portion sent to the east is as follows. The payment to the United Kingdom, 23 tons. General Rozanov's transfer to the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank, 20 tons. The purpose of this transfer was the dispersed storage of the gold bullion and facilitating settlements with foreign countries. The transfer to Semyonov, 34 tons. The illegal gold transfer by the corrupt officials, 21 tons. Of this, seized by Semyonov at Chita Station, 13 tons. Successfully transferred to Vladivostok without Semyonov's seizure, 8 tons. Transportation costs for fuel and other items, 6 tons. Seized by Semyonov in late October at Chita Station, 46 tons. The total, 150 tons. Subtracting the 150 tons sent to the east from the original 500 tons leaves 350 tons. These 350 tons constitute the stored portion. The Omsk government's officials loaded the stored portion onto trains destined for Irkutsk. These trains were 7 in total, and the gold was loaded onto the last train. Kolchak also got on this last train. I refer to this train as Kolchak's gold bullion train. The 6 trains that left earlier were running smoothly, but Kolchak's gold bullion train had trouble gaining speed. This was due to the immense weight of the loaded gold bullion. Nonetheless, their escape to Irkutsk began. Looking back, 1919. Let's take a look back at the events of 1919. In January, Kolchak established the Commission for investigating the execution of the imperial family. In the same month, the Omsk government army achieved consecutive victories against the Red Army and crossed the Ural Mountains. In March, the Omsk government army approached Samara. Other White Army forces also achieved consecutive victories against the Red Army. In late May, Semyonov and Kolchak reconciled. In June, Semyonov received 34 tons of gold bullion from Kolchak. In the summer, General Romanov passed through Chita Station with 20 tons of gold bullion. Semyonov initiated the Chita checkpoint operation. By the end of the summer, the White Army began to falter, and the Red Army switched to the offensive. In September, General Knox of the British forces proposed the withdrawal to Irkutsk and the transportation of the gold bullion, but Kolchak rejected this proposal. General Knox abandoned Kolchak, and the British forces withdrew by the end of the year. In late October, Semyonov confiscated 46 tons of gold bullion at Chita Station. On November 13th, Kolchak finally decided to retreat to Irkutsk. He loaded 350 tons of the stored portion of gold bullion onto Kolchak's gold bullion train for the journey. However, the gold was so heavy that the train's speed was extremely slow. Well, 1919 was a year of both glory and setbacks for Kolchak. Furthermore, it seems as if he was being held back by the gold bullion, which was his lifeline. On the other hand, Semyonov acquired a substantial amount of gold bullion. Furthermore, he did not send any reinforcements to Kolchak, so his forces remained intact. The next chapter takes us into the year 1920. Kolchak's Declaration of Abdication. On January 4th, 1920, Kolchak's gold bullion train finally arrived in Nizhnudinsk. While most of the trains that had left earlier had reached Irkutsk in about 10 days, Kolchak's gold bullion train took a month and a half and still couldn't reach its destination. Furthermore, Kolchak received more bad news. A coup had occurred in the new capital Irkutsk, and the capital functions that had been relocated were ruined. To make matters worse, some of the troops from the Omsk government army, which had arrived earlier, also instigated a rebellion. The coup was instigated not by the Bolsheviks, but by a political organization known as the Political Center. The Political Center held different political ideologies from the Bolsheviks, but that didn't make them allies of Kolchak. Their slogan was "Neither Lenin nor Kolchak," and they demanded Kolchak's arrest. There was nothing more Kolchak could do. Kolchak made a declaration of abdication. In other words, the Omsk government was defeated and dissolved. At this time, Kolchak passed on the title of the supreme ruler to Denikin, who was fighting alone in South Russia. Furthermore, he held a telephone conference with Semyonov, with whom he had disagreements, and entrusted him with political authority in Siberia. The Omsk government army, at its peak, had as many as 300,000 members, but only about 2,000 of them managed to reach Irkutsk. Betrayal of Czechoslovak Legion. On January 13th, Kolchak's gold bullion train arrived in Cheremkovo. On the 14th, the Czechoslovak Legion arrested Kolchak. This action was carried out in response to a request from the political center. On the following day, the Czechoslovak Legion handed over Kolchak to the political center. Unfortunately, at that time, the Kappel Legion had taken separate action, so there was no one to protect Kolchak. I will explain the Kappel Legion's separate actions later. When Kolchak left his gold bullion train, the Czechoslovak Legion became the new custodians of the gold bullion left on the train. Now, what I'd like to clarify here is the reasons why the Czechoslovak Legion betrayed Kolchak. I believe there were three main reasons. Reason 1. Due to the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their homeland Czechoslovakia had already achieved independence. Reason 2. Due to Kolchak's abdication, their employer, the Omsk government, disappeared. Reason 3. Perhaps this is the most significant reason. The Czechoslovak Legion likely wanted to bring back the immense amount of gold bullion left on Kolchak's gold bullion train to their homeland. This was quite reckless because both the Red Army and Semyonov were also targeting the gold left by Kolchak. Furthermore, they found themselves geographically sandwiched between the Red Army and the Semyonov Corps. Nevertheless, it was worth a try. On January 21st, things took an even worse turn for Kolchak. The Red Army overthrew the political center in Irkutsk. Naturally, Kolchak himself fell into the hands of the Bolsheviks. The political center was relatively moderate, so they likely had no intention of killing Kolchak. However, there was no reason for the Bolsheviks to spare Kolchak, who was the de facto leader of the White Army. In fact, the following month, Kolchak was killed. Kappel's death and tragedy of Lake Baikal. Before Kolchak's arrest, the Kappel Legion was in Krasnoyarsk. They found it impossible to travel east by train due to interference from the Red Army. Reluctantly, Kappel decided to lead his legion on foot towards Irkutsk. This was a significant decision. The season was midwinter, and Siberian winters are beyond imagination. Furthermore, Kappel wasn't only leading his legion, he was accompanied by a large number of refugees fleeing from the Red Army. It is said that it was a mass migration of well over 300,000 people in total. While Kappel was enduring his grueling journey, he heard ominous rumors. These rumors indicated that Kolchak had been captured by the Bolsheviks in Irkutsk. Kappel hastened his march, but at this point, his physical endurance leading the large group had reached its limit. To make matters worse, a severe Arctic cold snap struck, and as a result, Kappel froze to death. It was a dramatic and tragically young death for the man who remained loyal to Kolchak and the Romanov Dynasty until the very end. He passed away at the age of 36. However, the Kappel Legion and the refugees who had lost their leader were about to face further nightmares. They learned that Irkutsk had fallen into the hands of the Bolsheviks, and they had to bypass the city. To head east without passing through Irkutsk, they had no choice but to walk across the frozen surface of Lake Baikal. And at the end of January, an unprecedented tragedy in world history occurred, the tragedy of Lake Baikal. As they were walking on the ice of Lake Baikal, unfortunately, another severe Arctic cold snap struck, which was even more powerful than the one that killed Kappel. This devastating cold snap nearly wiped them out. It's almost unbelievable, but it's said that many of them froze to death while standing. During the Soviet era, this tragedy was largely unknown. This was because most of the victims were associated with the White Army, and they were pursued by the Red Army. Kolchak's gold bullion train, whereabouts of stored portion of 350 tons. During the time of the tragedy of Lake Baikal, Semyonov began to take action. He had obtained information that Kolchak's gold bullion train had arrived in Irkutsk. The Semyonov Corps departed from Chita and advanced towards Irkutsk. There, they entered into a conflict with the Czechoslovak Legion, which was guarding the gold bullion. As a result, the Semyonov Corps suffered defeat and retreated to Chita. This was a bitter loss for Semyonov. However, the Czechoslovak Legion had no reason to rejoice either. In fact, around the same time, they also engaged in combat with the Red Army and suffered a significant defeat. The Red Army, with its numerical superiority, was formidable indeed. Realizing their defeat, the Czechoslovak Legion chose to surrender to the Red Army. Bringing the gold bullion back to their homeland was indeed an impossible feat. They handed over all the gold bullion remaining on Kolchak's gold bullion train to the Red Army. In return, they were granted safe passage to Vladivostok. For the Czechoslovak Legion, arriving in Vladivostok meant returning home. This marked their departure from the gold bullion conflict. At that time, the actual amount of gold bullion handed over to the Red Army was 327 tons. Originally, there were 350 tons, so there was a decrease of 23 tons. The reasons for this reduction included fuel expenses, food costs, and theft. Kolchak was concerned about theft during the transportation of the gold bullion, and his expectations were somewhat accurate. It was Lenin who rejoiced, as the majority of the once-lost gold bullion had now returned. The End of Kolchak. On February 6th, Kolchak received a death sentence at the trial. Then, in the early hours of the following day, February 7th, Kolchak's execution by firing squad was carried out. He was 46 years old at the time of his death. Among the main leaders who fought in the Russian Civil War as part of the White Army, Kolchak was the only one captured and killed by the Red Army. Currently, his reputation has somewhat recovered. By the way, this February 7th, the day Kolchak was killed, was the day when the Czechoslovak Legion formally promised to hand over the gold bullion to the Red Army. Crucial moment. The collapse of the Omsk government led to a rapid eastward expansion of the Red Army's control. As a result, Transbaikal, under Semyonov's rule, shared the front line with the Red Army. By this time, other White Army leaders such as Yudenich, Denikin, Wrangel, and others had essentially been defeated. They fled the country within the year. As a result, the only remaining leader of the White Army was Semyonov. This is ironic because he did not desire the revival of the Russian Empire. The Allied powers, including Britain and France, had already withdrawn from Russia, but only the Japanese military remained in Siberia. This was fortunate for Semyonov. He had a good relationship with the Japanese military, and Transbaikal and Manchuria were adjacent to each other. Since Manchuria was within Japan's sphere of influence, it was easy for Semyonov to receive support from Japan. However, the Red Army was formidable, and even Kolchak, who was supported by the Allied powers, was defeated. Semyonov calmly analyzed the reasons for Kolchak's defeat. As mentioned earlier, there were 3 reasons. Let's review them once again. Reason 1. Lenin's total mobilization order. The Red Army controlled the more populated regions. Therefore, Lenin was able to secure a massive military force through conscription. Its scale was over 1 million. Reason 2. Sabotage. Lenin called for sabotage among the workers in the areas controlled by the White Army. Particularly, the sabotage by the port workers and railway employees in Vladivostok greatly troubled Kolchak. For Omsk, Vladivostok was crucial for the transportation of supplies. And needless to say, the same applied to Chita. Reason 3. Failure of economic policies. The Omsk government had its own currency, but it was only a provisional government, and it was in a wartime situation. In such circumstances, people had little faith in the Omsk government's currency. Without the credibility of the currency, there was no way to control inflation. People who had initially hoped for Kolchak were disappointed by the Omsk government, which couldn't even manage its economic policies satisfactorily. Now, what kind of strategy should Semyonov adopt? The situation is not in his favor. However, what we must not forget is that Kolchak and Semyonov had different conditions for victory. Kolchak's victory condition was the overthrow of Lenin. Therefore, he needed to advance as far as Moscow or Petrograd. On the other hand, Semyonov's victory condition was the establishment of the Greater Mongolia. In other words, he didn't need to advance as far as Moscow or Petrograd. He only had to contain the Red Army near Lake Baikal. However, how? Semyonov's conclusion was economic policy. This was one of the reasons why Kolchak lost. For Semyonov, Lenin's total mobilization order and sabotage were beyond his control, so practically, this was the only option. Fortunately, he had a substantial amount of gold bullion. Gold bullion sent from Kolchak, 34 tons. The illegal gold transfer confiscated during the Chita checkpoint operation, 13 tons. And in late October 1919, due to the deteriorating war situation, the Omsk government was transferring a portion of the gold bullion to Vladivostok, but it was confiscated by Semyonov at Chita station. The amount of gold bullion at that time, 46 tons. A total of 93 tons. This is equivalent to 4.65 billion US dollars. It's a substantial amount. The issue was how to use it. Issuing a separate currency, as the Omsk government did in the past, is quite imprudent. However, directly circulating the gold bullion itself is also impossible. Semyonov came up with a brilliant idea, utilizing the Chosen banknotes. Chosen refers to Korea, but at the time the Chosen banknotes were managed by Japan, so it was practically Japanese currency. The Chosen banknotes were widely circulated on the Korean peninsula, in Manchuria, and even in eastern Siberia under Semyonov's rule. It was the most trusted international currency in Northeast Asia, and currency that has high credibility is less likely to experience inflation. The Chosen banknotes were the best option for Semyonov. To acquire the Chosen banknotes, it was necessary to bring gold bullion to the Bank of Chosen in various cities in Manchuria. If the economic policy with the Chosen banknotes succeeded, Semyonov's power would have become stronger, and his core too. Hope is beginning to emerge. Gold Bullion Covert Transport Operation. Part 1. Chinese Eastern Railway becomes enemy. The nearest bank of Chosen from Chita was located in Harbin. Using the Chinese Eastern Railway, where Semyonov had once worked, one could quickly reach there. The visibility seemed good. However, a significant problem arose suddenly. The Chinese Eastern Railway prohibited Semyonov and his associates from using the railroad. During Kolchak's reign, the Chinese Eastern Railway did not view Semyonov as an adversary. After all, he was originally a part of the Chinese Eastern Railway. However, as soon as Kolchak was defeated, their perception changed, and they began to regard Semyonov as an enemy. The reason was simple. Semyonov did not desire the revival of the Russian Empire. The firm stance of the Chinese Eastern Railway was taken not by Horvat, but by Nikolai Kudyshev, the Russian ambassador stationed in Beijing. He was the new head of the Chinese Eastern Railway and had already dismissed the indecisive Horvat. Kudyshev, a legitimate duke, looked down on Semyonov, who was a Cossack. For Semyonov, He might have been a more troublesome adversary than Kolchak. Semyonov, prohibited from using the Chinese Eastern Railway, came up with a clever plan. He entrusted the gold bullion to trustworthy individuals to transport it, and needless to say, it was the Japanese military. However, there was one major concern. All Allied powers, aside from Japan, were demanding Japan's withdrawal from Siberia. They couldn't tolerate Japan's continued presence in Chita, much less Japan's collaboration with Semyonov. Japan was wary of the scrutiny from these Allied powers. Collaboration with Semyonov posed a significant risk for Japan. Nevertheless, as mentioned earlier, sharing a border with Soviet Russia was a nightmare for Japan. Thus, Japan wanted to support Semyonov in some way. In the end, both arrived at this conclusion: to secretly transport the gold bullion behind their back. And thus the Gold Bullion Covert Transport Operation was initiated. Gold Bullion Covert Transport Operation, Part 2, Operation A. It's foolish to transport all the gold bullion at once. The risks should be dispersed. Semyonov thought of transporting 7 tons first. That seemed like an appropriate amount. He further decided to split this 7 tons into 3 tons and 4 tons and send them separately to different branches of the Bank of Chosen. 3 tons to the Bank of Chosen's Harbin branch. 4 tons to the Bank of Chosen's Dalian branch. I'll refer to the former as the Operation A and the latter as the Operation B. On March the 2nd, the Operation A commenced. There were concerns about inspections by the Chinese Eastern Railway, but on March 8th, 6 days later, the gold bullion was safely delivered to the Bank of Chosen's Harbin branch. By the way, the Bank of Chosen recorded those who brought the gold bullion as ordinary individuals unrelated to Semyonov or the Japanese military. This, of course, was to conceal the collaboration between Semyonov and the Japanese military. Gold Bullion Covert Transport Operation, Part 3, Operation B. On March 13th, the Operation B commenced. The destination was the port city Dalian. Did it go as smoothly as the Operation A? The Japanese military train safely passed through Harbin Station, but encountered a railway employees' strike at Yaomen Station, just before Changchun Station. As a result, the locomotive of the Japanese military train was taken off and they became immobile. As mentioned earlier, Changchun Station, where the South Manchuria Railway and the Chinese Eastern Railway intersect, effectively served as the Russo-Japanese border. This fact meant that the Japanese military train's safety zone was south of Changchun Station. The mastermind behind this strike was likely Kutyshev. He directed his subordinate station master towards the Japanese military train. Needless to say, the purpose was for inspection. Kutyshev seems to have known about the gold bullion on the Japanese military train. Was he a psychic or something? Of course not. In fact, it was a well-known fact that Semyonov had a substantial amount of gold bullion. Concealing the fact of possessing large amounts of gold bullion was as difficult as it was for the previous Omsk government. As Yaomen Station was under the control of the Chinese Eastern Railway, if the station master found the gold bullion, he would have confiscated them immediately. The station master immediately demanded the Japanese military undergo an inspection. Naturally, the Japanese military refused. However, this station master was highly skilled. He pointed out that among the Japanese military there were 2 Russians. He discerned that these 2 individuals were associated with Semyonov. The unsettled Japanese military tried to justify that these 2 were just civilians, but it only deepened the station master's suspicion. And a few days passed. The station master remained as resolute as ever, so it was only a matter of time before the inspection took place. However, at that time, an unexpected figure aided the Japanese military. It was Zhang Zuolin, the supreme leader in Manchuria. Zhang Zuolin dispatched his troops to Yaomen Station and had the Japanese military train leave the station. Of course, the station master tried to stop this, but there was no way to oppose Zhang Zuolin. As a side note, Zhang Zuolin was later assassinated by the Japanese military. Semyonov and the Japanese military were saved by Zhang Zuolin. However, there's often a catch in such situations. Just before the Japanese military train arrived at Changchun Station, the locomotive of Zhang Zuolin's troops, which was pulling it, stopped. Then, Zhang Zuolin's troops aimed their guns at the Japanese military. Exactly, not only Kudyshev but also Zhang Zuolin was after Semyonov's gold bullion. The Operation B seemed like a failure, but things are unpredictable until the very end. Surprisingly, the Japanese military stationed in Changchun came to the rescue. Fortunately, this was the final upset. The gold bullion was later safely delivered to the Bank of Chosen's Dalian branch. Gold Rush. The Operation A and the Operation B ultimately succeeded. However, during the Operation B, the Japanese military made a fatal mistake. As mentioned earlier, the Japanese military and Zhang Zuolin's troops were about to have a fight over the gold bullion just before Changchun Station. Ultimately, the Japanese military stationed in Changchun came to the rescue and the gold bullion was protected. However, during this incident, the Japanese military, overly cautious, put the vicinity of Changchun Station on full alert. This situation was watched by an intelligence officer of the Allied powers, so the collaboration between the Japanese military and Semyonov got exposed. Japan was completely despised by the Allied powers. Moreover, it faced even stronger demands for a complete withdrawal from Siberia. Semyonov panicked. Since the Japanese military's withdrawal was already a matter of time, his only option was to hurry. Harbin became a city of gold in no time. It was a gold rush caused by Semyonov's gold bullion. Including the previously mentioned gold bullion covert transport operation, 62 tons were sent to the Bank of Chosen's Harbin branch, and 31 tons were sent to other branches of the Bank of Chosen. The total 93 tons was the complete amount of Semyonov's gold bullion. He ran out of it within just a few months. Defeat and communization. Semyonov dreamed of establishing the Greater Mongolia in the vast lands of eastern Siberia. However, in July, the Japanese military withdrew from Chita. Having lost its major supporters, the Semyonov Corps weakened in no time. In November, they suffered a significant defeat against the Red Army in the Battle of Matsievskaya. Then Semyonov fled to Manzhouli. Ironically, the Japanese military, Semyonov's once allies, disarmed him there. The Semyonov Corps disbanded, and the territories of the former Russian Empire were almost entirely communized. Looking back, 1920. Let's take a look back at the events of 1920. On January 4th, Kolchak's abdication. On the 14th of the same month, the Czechoslovak Legion arrested Kolchak. On the following day, the Czechoslovak Legion handed over Kolchak to the political center in Irkutsk. On the 21st of the same month, the Red Army overthrew the political center in Irkutsk, and Kolchak fell into the hands of the Bolsheviks. On the 26th of the same month, Kappel passed away. At the end of the same month, the tragedy of Lake Baikal occurred. Semyonov attempted to seize Kolchak's gold bullion train, but failed due to resistance from the Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechoslovak Legion beat the Semyonov Corps, but suffered a significant defeat against the Red Army. On February 6th, Kolchak was sentenced to death. On the following day, February 7th, Kolchak was executed by firing squad. On the same day, the Czechoslovak Legion promised to hand over all the gold bullion left on Kolchak's gold bullion train to the Red Army. In return, the Czechoslovak Legion was granted a safe return home. In March, Semyonov and the Japanese military executed the gold bullion covert transport operation, but it was exposed to the Allied powers. In places such as Harbin, the gold rush occurred. In July, the Japanese military withdrew from Chita. In November, the Semyonov Corps suffered defeat in the Battle of Matsievskaya. Then, Semyonov was disarmed in Manzhouli, and the Semyonov Corps disbanded. After that, Semyonov. In October 1922, the only remaining Japanese military within Russia withdrew completely from Siberia. The Allied powers' Siberian intervention ended in failure. On December 30th of the same year, the Soviet Union was established. Defeated in the Russian Civil War, Semyonov continued to actively operate from various bases, such as Nagasaki, Shanghai, and Tianjin. Particularly in Tianjin, he even engaged in gunfights with Soviet assassins. In Nagasaki, he attempted political activities but failed. He became estranged from the Japanese military, his former allies, but received a pension for retired military personnel calculatingly. After the establishment of the Empire of Manchuria, he operated from there as his base. However, in August 1945, with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which violated the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, he was arrested in Dalian and sent to Moscow. In the following year, 1946, Semyonov was executed within the Soviet Union. While it's presumed to have been by firing squad, there are also theories that it was an execution by hanging. Kolchak was killed by the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and eventually, Semyonov was also killed by the Red Army. I think these two were destined. They were politically opposed, but fought according to their own beliefs, and in the end, they were both killed. The Vanished Gold Bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. Summarization of flow of gold bullion. Let's summarize the flow of the Vanished Gold Bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. At the outbreak of World War I, the Russian Empire possessed 1,240 tons of gold bullion, which was equivalent to $62 billion. As the Russian Civil War began, the Red Army seized 976 tons of gold bullion from the national banks in Petrograd and Moscow. This was equivalent to $48.8 billion. The decrease of 264 tons was primarily paid to Britain as war expenses. Lenin stored 465 tons out of the 976 tons in Moscow, and he moved the remaining 511 tons to the Kazan branch of the National Bank. The gold bullion, which the Kappel Legion and the Czechoslovak Legion seized from the Kazan branch of the National Bank during their attack on the Red Army, amounted to precisely 500 tons. This was equivalent to $25 billion. The 500 tons of gold bullion was immediately handed over to the Omsk government. This gold was defined in this video as the Vanished Gold Bullion of the Romanov Dynasty. At this point, the distribution of gold bullion between the White Army and the Red Army was as follows. White Army, 500 tons seized by the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion. Red Army, 465 tons stored in Moscow, 11 tons spared from the seizure by the Czechoslovak Legion and the Kappel Legion at the Kazan branch of the National Bank. Total, 476 tons. The distribution of gold bullion between the two sides became almost equal. The Omsk government's 500 tons of gold bullion can be divided into two groups, the portion sent to the east and the stored portion. The portion sent to the east was 150 tons, and the stored portion was 350 tons. The breakdown of the portion sent to the east is as follows. Payment to the United Kingdom, 23 tons. Transfer to Semyonov, 34 tons. General Rozanov's transfer to the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank, 20 tons. The illegal gold transfer by the Omsk government's corrupt officials, 21 tons. Of this, seized by Semyonov at Chita station, 13 tons. Successfully transferred to Vladivostok without Semyonov's seizure, 8 tons. In October 1919, due to the deteriorating war situation, the Omsk government attempted to transfer a portion of the gold bullion to Vladivostok. However, it was confiscated by Semyonov at Chita station. The amount of gold bullion at that time, 46 tons. Transportation costs for fuel and other items, 6 tons. The stored portion of 350 tons was loaded onto Kolchak's gold bullion train, aiming for Irkutsk. However, following Kolchak's downfall, the Czechoslovak Legion handed over all of it to the Bolsheviks. However, the actual amount of gold bullion handed over to the Bolsheviks was 327 tons. The reason for this decrease of 23 tons was fuel expenses, food costs, and theft. The breakdown of Semyonov's gold bullion. The gold bullion sent from Kolchak, 34 tons. In late October 1919, due to the deteriorating war situation, the Omsk government was transferring a portion of the gold bullion to Vladivostok, but it was confiscated by Semyonov at Chita station. The amount of gold bullion at that time, 46 tons. The illegal gold transfer confiscated during the Chita checkpoint operation, 13 tons. Total 93 tons. This equated to $4.65 billion. Out of this 93 tons, 62 tons were sent to the Bank of Chosen's Harbin branch, and 31 tons, which were all of the remaining, were sent to other branches of the Bank of Chosin. By the way, what happened to the 20 tons of gold bullion that General Romanov brought to the Vladivostok branch of the National Bank after that? On January 30th, 1920, about a week before Kolchak was killed, Romanov, with the cooperation of the Japanese Navy, transferred all the gold bullion to Japan. If the gold bullion had been left in Vladivostok, it would eventually have been seized by the Red Army. At that time, Romanov and his family escaped to Japan too. The 20 tons of gold bullion were subsequently confiscated by the Japanese government. Similar to Britain, Japan, which was also nominally part of the Allied powers, had supported not only Semyonov but also the Omsk government. Therefore, they had the right to claim the assets of the defunct Omsk government. After that, Romanov fled to France with his family. Afterword. Thank you for watching until the end. How did you find my commemorable first video? There's one last point I'd like to add. It concerns the illegal gold transfer carried out by the corrupt officials of the Omsk government. I said this. The illegal gold transfer by the Omsk government's corrupt officials, 21 tons. Of this, seized by Semyonov at Chita station, 13 tons, successfully transferred to Vladivostok without Semyonov's seizure, 8 tons. Certainly there were the corrupt officials within the Omsk government. It is true that they were engaged in the illegal gold transfer to line their pockets. However, within those 21 tons, there was also a portion that wasn't transferred for such purposes. Those were primarily used to support the lives of exiled White Army members who had no choice but to live abroad due to their separation from their homeland Russia. I will add this fact for their honor. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. Finally, I would like to ask for your opinion. I would appreciate it if you could rate my video and, if possible, leave a comment. I intend to continue providing good videos on this channel in the future. See you in the next video.